passo velocemente scendiamo dal nord al sud Europa, andiamo a vedere in Spagna, che ha una legislazione invece in materia risalente ai tempi in cui l'abbiamo messa in piedi anche noi, cioè gli anni 90. Manuel Velez Fraga di Uría Menéndez in Madrid.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marco, and thank you very much to everyone for having the opportunity to talk about an example of how we deal in Spain with the foreign investment control. As Carolina was commenting, it is not a national issue for the future, but in Spain it has been like a very national issue and has been dealt with as something very national. And what I want to do is to talk about how it works in Spain, and then about some practical issues that have appeared on our experience that I think are interesting to think about in a situation in which, as a consequence of the European regulation, many countries in Europe may implement new foreign investment screening process. And in the case of Spain, we have to modify our system. For example, obviously, we don't have that possibility of commenting to other member states or these kind of things. So we are in a situation of amending our process. And I think it's a good moment to think about some practical issues that I want to comment. The situation in Spain may be summarized as follows. When you have foreign investments, direct foreign investments in companies, as a general rule, everything is free. And the law says, well, all foreign investments are free in Spain, but there are two exceptions. The first one is that the government, the Council of Ministers, has the power to suspend that liberalization regime on the grounds of public security, public order, or even public health. This is a suspension that is to be decided on a case-to-case basis, and I can say that it has never been applied, so there is nothing to worry about. And the second exception is that it is like a general exception in cases of foreign investments that may affect to companies that are related to national defense. So our experience, even though we have a law that comes from 1999, and as shown in the slide, and it was amended in 2003, our experience is only based on the prior approval, because in these particular cases, foreign investments need to receive an authorization prior to the performance or the execution of any agreement. So our experience is focused on the defense sector. And the idea here is that for the concept of national defense, this is under Spanish law a very wide concept, because it involves any activity related to the Ministry of Defense, as something like that. For example, if the company is a supplier of anything, even though it is not of a military nature, if it's a supplier of the Ministry of Defense, it may fall under this foreign investment control regime. So things work like that, because you need a prior approval. You have to request for the approval to the Ministry of Defense, and the last part in the process is the authorization granted by the Spanish government. But in practical terms, for example, let me say, there is no real cases of rejecting all the known decisions from the cabinet, from the Spanish government, have approved the decision. But the idea is that those that are not approved probably is because in the middle of the process, you receive certain message about that you are not going to receive the approval. During the process, there is like a report that needs to be issued by a specific board, and this is something that is not in the law, but it's like the administrative use in the Ministry of Defense of Spain. And if you don't receive a favorable report from that board, you can know that you are not going to receive the authorization. So those cases which are difficult to know because this is not public information that had not reached the approval is because in the middle of the process they have the message that they are not going to receive that, and probably the transaction was impossible to continue. And well, this is how things work, and this is just what I have until now is just what the Spanish regulation established. And that's why there are like some practical issues that in the day-to-day cases when we have these situations before the Ministry of Defense, the practical issues are things that we have to decide on a very informal relationship with the Ministry of Defense. And this is the issues that I want to focus on in order to think about some possible contents of the future legislation in Spain, and I think that may be interesting when thinking about other screening regulations in other member states. For example, I'm going directly to this kind of things. For example, in Spain, there has been controversy about what is a national defense-related company when you are talking about investment in a big holding. Probably the investor was not carrying out deep due diligence in the company and didn't know, in the case that I commented there, that there was a little subsidiary supplying certain services and goods to the Ministry of Defense. And this is the case of Amper, in which this case is interesting because it's the only one in which the investor didn't request for the approval, and the investor carried out the investment. So what happened? Well, what happened was that he received a fine. He was asked to request for the approval retroactively, and he received a fine of around €1 million, and he tried to challenge the fine before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that even though the investment was carried out in the holding level, because there was some subsidiaries carrying out activities related to national defense, the investor need to obtain that prior approval from the Spanish government. We in our firm receive, moving to the second issue, when the foreign investors ask about this, they ask if this kind of approval is discretionary or not discretionary, meaning that may I obtain that automatically on the grounds of closed parameters, or this is something in which there is a wide margin for discretion from the government that may decide on something that is impossible to know in advance. Well, the situation is that under Spanish law, these kind of authorizations are defined in a way in which we have to say to our clients that they cannot trust that because they fulfill some objective parameters, they are going to obtain that. So this is why, for example, this explains why there is no specific rejections, because at the end of the day, what the Spanish government can do is say, well, I'm not going to authorize it and I'm not going to issue any response. And because this is a discretionary power, it is impossible to challenge the rejection before Spanish courts, before the courts will say that they cannot dig into the decisions based on the grounds of public interest. Another interesting issue is that, anyone may think that a system of approval of investments should have a list of possible conditions, commitments, or remedies, as it happens for example, in antitrust regulation with mergers and these kind of things. Well, there is no any list under Spanish law. This makes some cases quite complicated. Last year there was an important case in Spain. A British company was acquiring the control of an industry aimed to produce the engines for the airplanes of the Spanish Air Forces. And the situation was that the government thought that it may be a risky situation, don't ask me why, and what they do was asking the British investor to assume some commitments in order to guarantee the interests of the Spanish air forces. The problem was that there are no lists. So what happened in practice was that this kind of commitments was the result of a negotiation, an open negotiation, in which at the beginning of the negotiation no one knew what was going to happen at the end, and probably the final outcome was something, well, probably good for both parties because they accepted everything, but it was something like no one may think at the beginning how it ended in the end. No? So this is something that when I talk with officers and these kind of things, I usually stress, because I would say that a good regulation on foreign investment should include a list of potential commitments, of potential remedies, which is something that, well, the European regulation does not include, if I'm not wrong, and probably that is something that the member states should think about when put in place this kind of regimes, because I mentioned there like the general principle of proportionality and the test necessary for complying with proportionality principle, but probably this is not enough when you have to deal with a specific negotiation. Almost in Spain, this wasn't enough, and the negotiations were really difficult because of the inexistence of a list. No? I mentioned there something that is probably something technical from the Spanish administrative procedure, but the problem we have in Spain is that, as I commented before, if you don't receive any answer to your request for an approval, it means that you have not the approval. So the problem is that when you are thinking about transactions in which usually the clients are very stressed about the terms, about when they can execute the transaction and these kind of things, having a public authority that may delay the answer for long is something not really good. And that's why, again, no, this is something just a thought. No, this is something that I would say, that a good regulation should be one in which the terms for the answer from the public authorities should be established in a reasonable way in order to avoid problems. And just to finish, and in very short, I just want to focus on what happens when there are infringement. I commented before that Spanish law provides a sanctioning regime in cases of lack of compliance with this kind of regime. This is a very strict regime because you can receive a penalty of the 100% of the economic value of the operation. Nevertheless, there is no precedence of something like that. And just a very short note about something that I think that should be included in these kind of regimes, which the Spanish law don't include, which is the consequences in the area of private law. There is always a debate about what happens if I don't request for the approval and I carry out the investment. Well, the Spanish law does not provide anything, so there is like a discussion about may the government order this investment or something like that. May the government go to civil courts in order to claim that the investment was a null and void contract? And this is something that is open to debate, and that I would say that thinking about future regulations in this regard is something that probably should be included. In Spain, there has not been cases in which the government order or ask for this investment, but this is something that I would say our future regulation should include. You know that in Spain we had, in the last year, elections to the government. Everything in the legislative area was stopped, and I hope that in the next conference I would be able to talk about something more specific. Thank you very much.
Grazie Manuel.